Welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast. The podcast that's not just about sugar, but about your relationship with it, and also with food, and especially with yourself. So if you want to discover your life after sugar and hear inspiring stories from all kinds of people who also cut out sugar in their way, at their pace, for their own reasons, this is the podcast for you. Because when you take away the sugar, you can finally discover the real sweetness in your life. I'm your host, Netta Gorman, and this is part 2 of the 100th episode anniversary of the Life After Sugar podcast. It's because when I asked my listeners to send in questions that they'd like me to talk about in the 100th episode, well, I got so many questions that I decided to do 2 episodes to answer them. So this is the second part. And if you haven't yet listened to episode 100, which was out last week, then do go back and listen to that and come back to join us here. In this episode, I'll be answering more questions from my listeners. For example, what do you do with cravings that hit at night? And also, was there ever a moment in your first year, mine, Netta, when you considered going back to life with sugar? And also, what do you do when you live with people who still consume sugar? Another question that I had is not so much about sugar, but about flour and whether different types of bread, like sprouted bread, is okay. And also, whether making your own fermented foods and drinks, like kombucha and sauerkraut, is really something that you could do on your own. And also the emotional eating part. Like, what do you do when you're having a stressful day and you just want to reward yourself for dealing with it? Or if someone's fighting with you and you're the type of person that likes to avoid conflict. That kind of stuff is not taught anywhere. And it can definitely be the major cause of this unhealthy relationship we have with sugar and comfort foods. I totally get that. And one final question I'll be answering in this episode is about how sugar affects our mental health. There is a lot of scientific proof that sugar is closely linked with depression and anxiety, and the gut-brain connection, in other words, the importance of gut health, is central to this question. And as a bonus, I'll be pointing you to lots of free resources to help with one of the most difficult parts of your life after sugar at the beginning, and that's to do with cravings. Because the truth is that cravings can really get in the way of living your life after sugar, especially if you're an intermittent faster. But the good news is that there is hope. It really is possible to get rid of cravings and feel that freedom that I talk about, which is also possible for you. All right, so here is the first question from one of my listeners who was asking, what do you do when your cravings hit at night? Now, I actually had a recent guest on my podcast who talked about exactly that. Her name is Dr. Lucy, and she comes from Australia, and she was on episode 98 of the Life After Sugar podcast talking about nighttime eating, whether it's in the evening or even during the night, and how we're kind of a little bit like Pavlov's dogs, where when somebody rang a bell, the dogs would salivate because they got into this habit, this conditioning of equating the ringing bell with food coming. And okay, so maybe we're not quite like dogs, but we humans are creatures of habit. And if we've spent years and years flopping on the couch, exhausted at the end of the day, and wanting to reach out for something sweet or salty and crunchy as a reward or as comfort, well, that's understandable, but it is a habit, and very probably a mindless habit. Although, if you're asking the question, then you're probably actually more mindful of it than you think. And that is a wonderful place to start, being more aware of what you're doing and the fact that you want to change a habit that isn't serving you anymore. One of the things I found helped me was to change the context in which this mindless habit kept repeating itself. So at the end of the day, instead of flopping on the couch in front of the TV, I would go for a walk or read a book or keep busy in other ways, either with drawing or crafting or even recording a podcast. Anything to get out of the old habit and into the new habit. Now, that doesn't mean that I would ignore or invalidate the need for comfort and reward. It's just that you can go and find other ways than sugary or starchy snacks to meet that valid need. So my question back to you is, how are you going to start changing the context of that lifelong habit of snacking during the evening? And one other thing, if you are actually snacking because you're hungry, which is rarely the case, but it could happen, instead of looking at what snacks you can eat that are, air quotes, healthy, have a look back to what you last ate and see if there was something in your meal or the types of foods that you've been eating during the earlier part of the day that are actually triggering cravings. Either foods with added sugars or starchy types of foods, especially processed starches, because sometimes those types of foods can actually stimulate your hunger even if you eat lots of them. For example, pasta, bread, crackers, none of those are sweet, but they are starchy and they are flour-based, and they could be the culprits for stimulating your hunger hormones. So look back rather than looking forward and see if you can put your finger on which foods you may have been eating that are stimulating your hunger and which foods actually keep you full. Here's a hint: unprocessed sources of proteins and healthy fats are likely to keep you much fuller than processed sources of starches and added sugars. I hope that helps a little bit. Here's another question from a listener. Was there ever a moment in your first year, mine, Netta, when you considered going back to life with sugar? Well, if you ever listened to the very first episode of this podcast, episode 1 of the story behind Life After Sugar, you may have heard me tell the story of how I started this whole no sugar thing and how I resisted it for the longest time. There was no way I wanted to give up sugar, promise, and certainly not chocolate or my comfort foods. It was a hard no from me, and the only reason why I did it in the end was because I was just suffering so much from digestive issues and other health issues that I thought, I'll give it a try, but just for 2 weeks, just for a temporary period. I certainly never thought it would be any longer than that, let alone become a podcast. So I never saw it as a lifelong thing, a forever project. So it wasn't particularly daunting for me to give it a try because I honestly thought that it would be just for a couple of weeks, just a short-term adventure. And when this short-term adventure did turn into, well, my life after sugar, I was the first to be amazed at my own behavior, at my own commitment, not just to not eating sugar, but to feeling great. And this is what made all the difference for me, especially in the first year where it's always the first time for everything, right? First birthday without sugar, first holiday period without sugar, first Valentine's Day without sugar, first everything without sugar. And that's not always easy. I mean, it can be really uncomfortable to be the odd one out in social occasions. And by social occasions, I mean where food's involved. Because, let's face it, eating is primarily a social activity, and other people are bound to pass comment on what's on your plate or what's not on your plate. So yes, it was sometimes challenging to have people pass comment on this dessert queen's 180-degree turnaround. And I get it. I mean, not everybody was aware of what I was doing and why, and not everybody understood how it's possible to actually enjoy life without sugar. But did I feel like going back to eating sugar in my first year? I have to say, no, not really, because I felt so awful with sugar, despite its short-term benefits, and by short-term I mean a few seconds. The long-term disadvantages far outweighed the good, no pun intended, and just feeling like I was getting younger all the time, like I was the Benjamin Button of sugar, and feeling so much better and more energetic and supple, with my skin glowing and fitting into my clothes again and finding my younger body back again. I mean, so many good things were happening from my not eating sugar the more the year went on, that I didn't want to go back. Not even when I was having cravings. And although I'm not perfect, believe me, I'm really not, where sugar's concerned, it was a sweet breakup. Why? Because after a while, I was able to step back and really start thinking about my relationship with sugar and, well, how toxic it was. And in my 40s and now in my 50s, believe me, there is no place in my life for toxic relationships. And that, I think, was a really important realization for me. My well-being is worth more than sugar. And it turns out that that's really what I teach inside of the After Sugar Club, because most people who come to see me when they're ready to stop eating sugar, well, they know all the info about sugar and the different types of sugar and where sugar is hidden, or at least they know most of that info because there's so much information out there. What I love helping people with is how to implement, how to live day by day, week by week, month by month, and year by year, not without sugar, but after sugar. Because life after sugar, as I found out, and as many others are also finding out, is all about the freedom you feel from the hold that sugar has on you. And that goes way beyond sugar itself, because it's actually all about you and how you want to live your life. The next listener question I want to answer is, what do you do when you live with people who still consume sugar? Yeah, this is a real challenge for many, many people, and in many ways myself included, because eating, especially with family, is a social activity. And if you have people who you live with who don't get where you are on your path to being sugar-free, or why you even decided to cut sugar, then yes, it can be a challenge, definitely. In the circles I move in, there's an expression, food pushers, or food pushing, which refers to the external pressure that other people put on you, or that you feel that they're putting on you, and that can make it very hard to stay on track and get results. And by pressure, it can be guilt trips, or tempting you into eating things that you're trying to stop eating, or bringing foods into the house that you've asked them not to, or going against your own best interests with whatever you've decided to eat or not eat anymore. And these types of words and behaviors from other people, especially people living with you and who are close to you, well, these can come in many shapes and sizes. And very often it's a question of them not understanding your issues because they don't share them. Or if they do, they're not ready to recognize them. So my suggestion from personal experience and from experience with the After Sugar Club members who've asked for help in this instance is to be firm but kind. I mean, people love to give you their unwanted opinions, especially when they say things like, oh, you've got to have a little bit of everything. Don't deny yourself. A little of what you fancy does you good. I get the sentiment behind that, but actually, for many of us, when it comes to sugar and flour for some of us, actually, a little bit isn't good for us. And it's not about the food not being good, it's about how it triggers our behavior and our cravings. That's what's not good for us. And it can go right back to childhood. Some of us were told to eat everything on our plate, or that we won't have dessert if we don't eat our veggies. And even as adults, the people who are eating with us or living with us can say well-meaning comments, but that can actually cause more harm than good. What you need to realize is that your feelings are at least as important as anyone else's, and your health and well-being is your number one priority. So the challenge is to express how you feel nicely, politely, but firmly, so that the person offering you food that you've chosen not to eat anymore, even if you used to love it, understands that you recognize that their gesture is coming from a place of love, but that the food itself is something that you need to say no to. If you can explain that kindly, gently, but firmly, then the chances of their feelings getting hurt can be lessened. You don't have to justify your refusal because a simple no thanks is enough. But sometimes food pushers will push. And it can certainly be tricky to navigate other people's perceptions and feelings. So you need to be aware of that and to strike a balance between expressing how you feel and recognizing how they feel. And if you need more support and understanding in this issue, then come join us in the After Sugar Club. This is the kind of thing we talk about in our check-in calls. I just wanted to take a quick break to say thank you for listening to this podcast, and if it's your first time here, welcome. And if you haven't done so already, could I ask you to please rate this podcast by scrolling down and tapping on the stars? And please write a short review to let me know how this podcast is inspiring you in your life after sugar. The more ratings and reviews this podcast has, the more it gets suggested on people's podcast players, and the more people will discover it, and the more people we can help. And I'd just like to read out a couple of reviews for the Life After Sugar podcast now. Here's one from Grand64 who says, as a retired registered nurse for 36 years at a teaching facility in Birmingham, Alabama, I would like to say this was extremely informative and I truly enjoyed it. Thank you. And from Natural Curly, a 5-star review that says, I am thankful I stumbled on your podcast. Your voice is calming and your content is helpful. And one more review from SM Waxer, who says, listening to Life After Sugar educates and motivates me. I love the life-changing stories. Thank you, and thank you to all of you for rating, reviewing, and sharing this podcast. So one other question that I had is not so much about sugar, but about flour and whether different types of bread, like sprouted bread, is okay. So as you probably know by now, I don't see food in terms of okay or not okay, or allowed or not allowed, but it's a great question about bread here. And I'm certainly not against whole grains. But here's the thing with flour. When whole grains have been ground up into a powder, which is really what flour is, even if those whole grains start off with fibre in them, that fibre is also ground up when the grains are milled into flour. And studies have shown that when the fibre in grains is ground up, well, it kind of loses its capacity to slow down the absorption of the starches in the grains, and therefore the effect that flour, even brown whole grain flour, has on the body can be similar to the effect that sugar has on the body. And one other thing, these days, most wheat flours or other types of flours are very often used in processed products and commercial products, including commercial breads and baked goods, and they're mixed up with all kinds of other ingredients, very often including sugar. So even if you're making your own bread at home, and even sourdough bread, it's still flour-based, and the effect of flour still affects the body in a similar way to sugar. And if you're buying commercially made breads and baked goods, well, just be aware that they are flour-based products and they do contain all kinds of other ingredients that very often are also processed. Does that mean that you shouldn't eat products made with flour? No, but just be aware of what those products do to your body, because different people's bodies react in different ways. Personally, it's not so much the sugar rush or the glucose spike that bothers me when I eat bread. It's my behavior. Once I taste one slice of bread, I just want more and more and more. And quite frankly, after 7 years of not having that behavior in my life, I don't want it back again. So for me personally, no bread is better. And the other thing about flour, and I quote Bright Line Eating's Susan Peirce Thompson here, is that it keeps our dopamine receptors in party mode, as she says. And for some people, food addicts especially, they need to calm down their response to sugar, and flour is included in this dopamine response. If bread doesn't trigger this type of behavior for you, then go ahead. But getting back to the original question, one type of bread is Ezekiel bread made with sprouted grains, and it's a much more nutrient-dense bread because it's made from sprouted grains and legumes that have started germinating or sprouting, and compared to white or even whole wheat bread, Ezekiel bread is much richer in nutrients and fibre. Again, I'm not anti-bread, and I'm not even anti-sugar and flour. So if you find that eating this type of bread doesn't trigger any type of dopamine rush or sugar rush or behavioral rush, then go ahead and eat it. I don't think that bread in and of itself is unhealthy or healthy. I'm more interested in your relationship and your behavior with the bread. Here's another listener question that I got. Is making your own fermented foods and drinks, like kombucha and sauerkraut and yogurt, something that you can really do on your own? Well, I've been doing it on my own at home for the last 7 years with no problems whatsoever. And a lot of the members of the After Sugar Club also started making their own fermented foods and drinks with my guidance. And there's a huge population of home fermenters around the world. Is it dangerous to leave foods on the countertop at room temperature to ferment? Well, I suppose it can be if you don't follow the instructions properly. But funnily enough, a lot of people seem much more wary of probiotic fermented foods and drinks than they are of highly processed industrial foods and drinks. I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because the marketing for those industrially concocted food and drink products is so much better and better funded than any marketing for probiotic fermented foods and drinks. And just as an aside, I do realise that there is a lot of marketing for commercial kombucha and yogurt and milk kefir. The food industry will jump on any new products they can to make sure they sell them. But yes, the short answer is that it's totally possible and much easier than you would think and much cheaper to make your own fermented foods and drinks at home. And they're also a delicious way to look after your gut health, much more delicious than those expensive probiotic capsules. When you have the right ingredients, the recipes, and the guidance from someone with several years of experience fermenting their own probiotic fermented foods and drinks, then you have everything you need to give it a go yourself. And you get all that inside of the After Sugar Club. If you want to hear other podcast episodes about fermented foods and drinks, then go listen to episode 48 with Holly Howe and also episode 75 with Donna Schwenk. One other question I got from a listener was about emotional eating. Most of us, myself included, never learned any other coping skills than using sugar for reward, stress relief, soothing, when we're bored or tired or angry, or having a fight with someone, or facing a difficult conversation with our boss, or any other type of emotional situation. It's not that sugar is the best way to cope, it's just the only way that we've ever learned. There's no shame in that. And the key, in my experience, is first to recognize that we're using sugar as a coping mechanism, and second, to recognize that there are other, healthier ways to deal with our different emotions, and that our emotions are 100% valid, and we can learn to actually feel them and express them in a healthy way instead of squashing them down and literally smothering them with chocolate. It's funny because I consider that I'm one of the worst references when it comes to dealing with and expressing my emotions, and yet when I stopped eating sugar, I had no other choice but to find other ways than cookies and ice cream and chocolate to deal with the discomfort, albeit temporary, of, well, having a feeling. And actually in the After Sugar Club, when we have our live support calls that I call check-in calls, a lot of the time we end up talking about coping skills and resources to help us develop healthier coping skills so that eventually you don't need or miss sugar anymore. That's the freedom that I talk about when I talk about letting go of sugar. Now, I'm not claiming this is easy, and it's a lifelong process. I'm still in it, 7 years down the road. But one of the coping skills that we can develop is setting boundaries and learning to say no firmly but effectively. No to others and no to sugar. Not just to eating sugar, but to giving sugar the power to determine whether we feel good or bad or anything. For me, one of my challenges when I was learning new coping skills was to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I do recognize that the temporary discomfort that I used to have at first with cravings, for example, well, that's a pretty first world problem to have, but it didn't make me suffer any less. I mean, the suffering is real when you're in the throes of cravings, right? And so learning to lengthen that window of tolerance and be able to feel calm enough to learn from our experiences and feel our feelings, well, that's a real challenge for most of us, myself included. But it's also a skill that we can learn to develop, just like learning a new language. And although other coping skills may not give us the dopamine hit we're looking for when we reach out for sugar, we can learn to get used to slightly lower highs when we do other activities that are just as enjoyable, but that don't give us this dopamine rush. Like what? Well, we can meditate, exercise, journal, draw, listen to music, take a bath, play with your pet, go out and enjoy nature, read a book, play a game, do some knitting or crafting, pray, find humor in little things, make a gratitude list, do some coloring or gardening, or do some yoga, go to bed early, drink some tea, squeeze a stress ball, play a musical instrument or listen to music or your favorite podcast, talk to a friend or ask for help, practice deep, slow breathing, schedule quality time for yourself and with your family, express your feelings, cry, laugh, smile, go take a walk, go see a movie. Any of these and more can replace sugar as coping skills. And as I mentioned before, if you think that they don't give you quite the same high as sugar does, well, you're right. And that's the whole point. Learning other coping skills also means learning to enjoy lower highs. Because I can tell you that after all these years of my life after sugar, real life carries on even when you don't eat sugar. So what you do have control over is how you deal with different types of stresses in your life. And that gives you your personal power. And if you have a whole range of other coping skills that you can turn to, then eventually you'll find that sugar will lose its hold on you. Try it and see. And this brings me to one other question that I got from a listener about how sugar can affect our mental health. I mean, I'm not denying that sugar used to make me feel better whenever I felt sad or down or upset or angry or frustrated. And I had periods in my life when I was suffering from depression and anxiety, and I would never have made the connection between my mental health and sugar. But multiple studies have found a link between diets that are high in added sugars and depression, because overconsumption of sugar triggers imbalances in certain brain chemicals, including serotonin, of which 95% is produced in the gut. Can you believe it? Gut bacteria manufacture about 95% of the body's supply of serotonin. And serotonin is an important neurotransmitter that carries messages between nerve cells in the brain and throughout your body. And it does that via the vagus nerve. So this is why I'm such a believer in looking after your gut health, first by cutting sugar and also by adding probiotic fermented foods and drinks to your diet, because studies have shown that the hormones and neurotransmitters that are responsible for our moods and our mental health have a strong link with our gut health. And when our gut health is upside down because we're eating too much sugar, then these imbalances can lead to depression and may even increase the long-term risk of developing a mental health disorder in some people. Now, I'm no scientist or health expert, but I can tell you my personal experience of a lifetime with mood swings, PMS, depression and anxiety, right into my 40s, well, I can tell you that cutting sugar and adding probiotic fermented foods and drinks to my diet has made a world of difference for my general mood and that of everyone close to me. If you need more proof, it's out there. There's no shortage of scientific studies that show the relationship between a diet high in sugar and mental health. But my personal suggestion to you is to give it a try. Cut sugar as much as you possibly can, right down to 0 if you're game for it, and see the difference that it makes in your mood, sometimes within a few days or weeks, and for some people it can take a few months. But as much for your physical health as your mental health, cutting sugar certainly can't hurt. And while you're cutting down sugar, if you do get cravings, I have 5 tips for you to help get rid of them, especially if you're an intermittent faster and you know that sugar's getting in the way of the easy intermittent fasting lifestyle that you're looking for. To get my 5 tips, go to my website, aftersugarclub.com, and click on the button, Get Rid of Cravings. And I also have lots of free resources on my website for you. That's aftersugarclub.com. You can also get more free resources on the Life After Sugar YouTube channel, the Life After Sugar Facebook page, and come and subscribe to my Instagram account at My Life After Sugar, which is where I post pictures of what I do, what I eat, sometimes pictures of our cat, and basically just to show that you can live a perfectly happy and active life even if you don't eat sugar. I hope this listener Q&A has been helpful for you, and if you want more support from me and from our lovely community, then come and join us in the After Sugar Club. Just go to aftersugarclub.com and click on the green button, Join the Club. You'll get access to our live support calls that I call check-in calls, and that's where you'll get the support, the guidance, and the insights you need to really let go of sugar and discover the real sweetness in your life. Oh, and before you go, please remember to rate and review this podcast and share it as much as you can so that we can help as many people as we can to live their life after sugar. Thank you for listening. That's it for this week. Keep in touch and see you soon for another episode.